Hey everybody. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here. Seeing as how you're watching this video, I'd imagine that you're at least tangentially interested in learning about things, or at the very least being briefly entertained. And, well, you're in the right place to do it. Strange stories and obscure information alike have, in the dawning years of the information age, been suddenly and unceremoniously rocketed to the forefront of the public consciousness. A lucky individual in the present day needs only to open their mind to the great Rexus-selected stream, and they'll become privy to bits of knowledge both practical and utterly pointless that previous generations couldn't have even dreamed of. I'm sure you're familiar with the practice. You simply launch your web browser of choice and make the pilgrimage to www.youtube.com. But is that actually where you're going? People within the bounds of my generation are digital natives. They've grown up, surrounded by and culturally immersed in the technologies of the global network, and as a result, many of the practices surrounding it have been abstracted and colloquialized. No one younger than 50 needs to be reminded what it means to visit a site, and terms like email and internet have been adopted into conversational speech so thoroughly that we don't even capitalize or punctuate them properly anymore. But this doesn't necessarily translate to a more complete understanding regarding the great hulk of data systems that underlie the net. It's commonly understood that when you punch in the domain name of your favorite platform, your browser's accessing the website located at that address. But the truth is far less straightforward. Simply put, the domain you enter in a technical sense doesn't really mean anything site-wise. The decades of governmental, scientific, and corporate development required to give you the ability to type Minecraft.net into the search bar and actually get something meaningful is truly fascinating to reflect on, as is the small handful of times that someone's managed to cause difficulty for the system. A story of rapid technological advancement, of clashing corporate interests, and of an expansive system that most people don't give a second thought to today. And if you'll pardon the personal aside, I just think DNS is really cool, and I wanted to talk about it for a while. So I give you, your domain does not exist. DNS, the fittingly named domain name system, is one of the fundamental forces that keeps the internet of today running smoothly, alongside slightly better known protocols like HTTP and IP. The service it provides is a simple one, at least on the surface. It allows internet users and systems to correlate otherwise meaningless host names and domains with usable IP addresses and other adjacent tasks. This will be expanded upon later, I promise, but by and large, the most common analogy used is that of an address book. The average person is conditioned not to remember 10-digit phone numbers, but to keep an internal record of names. You don't introduce yourself with your area code. But a name isn't going to do you much good if you actually want to contact that person remotely. Savvy communicator that you are, you take out your address book and find the phone number that corresponds to the name you seek. You don't have to remember numbers at all as long as you know where to find that book. The phone number in this analogy is your standard IP address. Long, hard to remember, but technically meaningful. The domain name is, well, the name. Mnemonic, easy to recollect, but perfectly meaningless when you want to make a call. Your browser or whatever client-side application you're using uses DNS as its address book, performing a lookup on a human-readable address and getting an IP that can actually point it in the proper direction. But of course, it hasn't always been this way. Now, the difficulty in remembering a numerical address isn't a new phenomenon, and the use of more memorable host and domain names dates back to the ARPANET days. The primary difference, of course, being that in those days you could fit the sum total of net users and hosts in a reasonably sized McDonald's. The entirety of ARPANET existed in what would become the 10.0/8 block, 1/256th of our current IPv4 addresses alone, and even that was massively, massively excessive for the actual number of machines within that network. So instead of a complex worldwide domain lookup system, you had a handful of very diligent people at Stanford writing addresses down in a text file. In 1974, a department at the Stanford Research Institute called the Network Information Center, or NIC, began working to facilitate the usage of host names. Run by scientist Elizabeth Jake Feinler, the purpose of NIC was to process requests from ARPANET users who wanted a host name assigned to their machine, and to input the name-address correspondence into a database that users could query. I guess you could consider it a database. In reality, it was a single text file called hosts.txt that Feinler and the NIC staff maintained on a host called Office 1. Address entries could be performed by emailing or calling NIC, except when they were out of the office, and address lookups were as easy as connecting to Office 1 and just reading the file. And this system worked for around 8 years. But as expected, in its gradual but entirely uncompromising way, the net continued to expand. In the early years of the 1980s, it was deduced by the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, that running the entirety of the internet's name servers off a single file at Stanford wasn't the most robust or efficient way to go about things. And beginning around 1982, multiple new methods and systems were trialed to serve as replacements. An official call for a new system went out with the publishing of RFC 882 in November of 1983, and later RFC 920 in October of 1984. The initial paper, written and designed by networking pioneer Paul Macapetras, would go on to define the requirements and specifications for what we now know as DNS. As fate would have it, the most defining and enduring implementation of DNS software, the Berkeley Internet Domain System, or BIND, was developed in May 1984 by, as you may have guessed, a group of students at UC Berkeley. BIND ran on Unix platforms and has since become the most well-known DNS software package, developed early on by a company that would become part of the present Hewlett-Packard, and maintained for upwards of 40 years by the Internet Software Consortium. And the rest, as is often said, is history. Today, the domain name system is not run out of a NIC office. In fact, it's not located in a single place at all. The modern DNS is vaguely decentralized in the way a number of modern internet infrastructure systems are, and the way it operates has always been incredibly fascinating to me. The first thing to understand, and arguably one of the least intuitive, is that DNS looks at domain names backwards. Any given domain is constructed of several namespaces, representing the set of all domains beginning, or I suppose ending, with a given prefix or suffix. This is getting confusing. Essentially, all domain names ever fall under dot, as in the imaginary final dot at the end of every domain name, as if you were going to have another piece of text tacked onto it. Then comes the top-level domain, or TLD. These are things like .com and .gov and .football. In its own weird little rings of power type event, the internet began with just one TLD, .arpa, forged in the unending darkness of the year 1983, as a sort of stopgap while the internet transitioned to using this new namespace system. But 2 years later, 7 more were forged, to be gifted unto the lesser host machines of the realm. These are the ones you're likely most familiar with, .net and .gov and so on. Somewhere along the way, things got a little out of hand because now there's over 1,500 of them, but at least we have .life insurance. Anyway, these all exist within that first dot, the root namespace, but they each represent a namespace of their own. Every domain that's suffixed with a particular TLD belongs to that TLD's namespace. Google.com is in the .com namespace, Minecraft.net in the .net space, you know the drill. And it just keeps going from there. Usually the chain stops 3 or 4 layers deep, either with the www or the string that follows it. And this is traditionally where the actual site can abstractly be found, but you can go as far down as needed. But this, of course, is all abstract. How does it actually work? Well, let's trace it. It begins when you hit enter on your URL bar. Say you're going to YouTube. Your browser doesn't understand what that means, so it queries a local recursive resolver. This is the first link in the chain and the only one the system can't get on its own. This is the equivalent of knowing where in your house the phone book actually is so you can do a lookup. Remember, without an IP address, no computer connected to the net will know how to connect to any other computer. Luckily, your ISP will almost always hook you up, and during the host assignment that happens when you link up with a local network, your computer usually gets the address of a nearby resolver it can use. Sometimes it's part of your local router, sometimes it's stashed away in a server room somewhere, and sometimes it's a public service offered by a network infrastructure company like Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1. Where it is isn't really important because now your computer knows exactly who to ask. If you're lucky, the resolver will already have the IP cached. In an effort to save time and resources, many local resolvers keep a short-term cache of recently accessed domains and their IPs. And in this case, a response immediately bounces back and your browser knows where to go. But since this would be pretty boring, let's say the resolver's never heard of YouTube before. The process now basically follows the order of the namespaces we touched on just a little while ago. The resolver reads the dot at the end of your domain and shoots off a message to the big boss at the top of the DNS chain, root DNS. There are officially 13 of them, lettered A through M and granted their great power and influence by the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. But in actuality, each of these actually represents anywhere from 2 to over 100 actual server sites through a protocol called Anycast, allowing root to handle the truly massive daily traffic load resulting from all DNS traffic being routed through them in one way or another. Resolvers, first and foremost, reach out to one of the many root servers with a simple query. Where the hell can I find www.youtube.com? Well, root can't tell it that, but it can tell the resolver where to find someone who can. Root dispenses with a record, or a set of records, containing an IP address for a TLD DNS. In this case, the servers with authority over .com, as root holds records of the addresses for servers pertaining to every TLD known to exist. Receiving this response, the resolver sends off the same query to the .com servers, but they don't know where to find YouTube either. However, they can get us a little closer. A TLD DNS server holds the records of the name servers for every domain that falls under its command. So while it can't tell your resolver exactly where to find YouTube, it just so happens to know that this particular bit of information can be found on ns1.google.com, which it just so happens to have the IP address for. This is an authoritative server. It's the only kind of DNS provider that can officially tell you the IP for a specific address, and it's generally the last stop on the journey. One last time your resolver asks its question, and finally somebody gives you a straight answer. Head on over to 142.250.64.78, it says, and you'll find what you seek. Satisfied, your resolver responds to your browser's original query, and with that, your machine performs a handshake with the web server and establishes a TCP connection. You may be wondering what the point of all this asking and re-asking is when it might perhaps be quicker to just distribute a list of addresses. The answer, as you might have also guessed, is that that list would be invalidated the precise moment somebody decided to switch servers, but keep their domain name. If that happened to be a single site, not a big problem. If it was root, or one of the major TLD servers, you're now stranded up the networking version of the proverbial creek without a proverbial paddle to speak of. This is why it's so crucial that all these moving parts work together so smoothly. It's the internet. Things are constantly changing, and actually knowing the real-time address of any network server on the planet is, I think, worth having to query a couple of servers across the country. Of course, this all happens in terms of milliseconds, so in all likelihood, it's already occurred before your finger even leaves the enter key. This is likely part of what gives rise to the belief that your browser actually knows where to go when you punch in a new address, instead of stumbling around asking servers until somebody drops a hint. But that, in a sense, is basically DNS. Obviously, there's a lot more functionality to it and a lot more that happens beneath the surface. DNS also handles email requests, labeled as MX records instead of the domain name A records in the server databases. The YouTube lookup I described here also isn't quite as easy as I made it seem. For ease of access, www.youtube.com is actually stored as an alias, or CNAME record, which in the case of the authoritative Google name server, actually tells the resolver to ask again, this time for YouTube's canonical name, that being youtube-ui.l.google.com. This is obviously considerably more annoying to remember than youtube.com, but with things like CNAME records, little kinks like this are easy to work out. The system is smart too. It's constantly performing load balancing, making sure that requests are distributed among servers so as to not accidentally DDoS them. The classic method was known as round-robin DNS, which consisted of servers shuffling a list of potential target servers every time they were requested, so each one got their time in the spotlight. Of course, a number of drawbacks have been exposed in the many years since this method was in practice, and these days more complex and dedicated load balancing algorithms come into play. But even with load balancing, some among you may rightfully be wondering how the hell this all manages to run so smoothly. How can a small handful of agencies and nonprofits administrate such a robust and far-reaching global infrastructure system? Basically, how can ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, run every single root DNS server? Well, you might have already guessed the answer. They don't. They really, really don't. Well, okay, that's sort of a lie. They run one of them, the L server to be specific. L-Root carries the distinct honor of being the only one of the 13 current root name servers to be directly administrated and operated by ICANN. But the rest, they get outsourced. A handful of these are run by scientific and government organizations. B-Root is run by University of Southern California. K-Root is run by a European nonprofit called RIPE. G-Root and H-Root are run by the Department of Defense and the US Army respectively. But many of the others are run by publicly traded companies. This is part of the weird little area of intersectionality where computer science and engineering and corporate interests start to intermingle. Now, before we get into that, how about an intermission? For one, it'll let you guys process whatever you need to process. And for another, it'll let me talk about, believe it or not, a sponsor. You may or may not know this, but I very rarely take these since they're overwhelmingly just the scummiest things you can imagine. But today's sponsor is something I genuinely think is really neat. This video is sponsored by the Curiosity Box. For those not aware, Curiosity Box is a subscription service originated by Michael of Vsauce fame, which ships these neat boxes full of science and engineering adjacent trinkets and stuff to your door multiple times a year. They graciously sent me this free box, which I will now open. First, I've received this really neat looking sundial, which once I actually put it together, works with surprising precision. I got this chocolate mold that somehow imbues a chocolate bar with this like mythical rarity, Borderlands pearlescent shine. I do not understand how this one works, but it's incredibly cool to look at in person. I got a shirt with the original Bohr atomic model on it. The material is surprisingly comfortable. Does it look good on me? You guys get to decide. Also included was this confounding set of wire puzzles, which I, in my limited time, was not able to figure out. Maybe you guys can take a crack at it. And finally, I received this unique copy of The Clock That Went Backward, a hardback collection of very early science fiction stories by 19th century author Edward Page Mitchell, along with some appropriately themed stickers. There's a lot to unpack with this one, and it caps off the variety of goods that precede it. All promotional stuff aside, I honestly do think this stuff is really sick. There's no trick or gimmick. It's just a handful of fun gifts you receive a few times a year. I built this channel off, a general sense of wonder surrounding the more mundane fixtures of our world. And if that's something you enjoy, I can see the Curiosity Box as being something you'd like as well. They've even hooked me up with a promo code. Use CPTKRB. That's CPTKRB. I don't know how I can simplify that. At checkout and get 25% off your first box or $15 off the annual plan. This also helps my channel out. So if you're considering a box of your own, don't forget to use it. Anyway, That's all I got. And with that, we'll take it back to the topic at hand. Where were we? Oh yeah, outsourcing. You see, when systems like DNS and IP and DHCP and so on were first introduced, the internet was really just a small community where strongly centralized systems weren't really needed. And if they were, they existed as tiny, manually run operations like Nick's host file. But when the net exploded with a raging torrent of new and inexperienced users, and that torrent showed no signs of easing up, it was clear that this was no longer tenable. In other words, big-ass servers were going to be needed if everything was to work smoothly. Authoritative servers could basically run themselves. Webmasters and startups would be able to set up and register them on their own. But for root and TLDs, someone with deep pockets and a fair bit of technical knowledge would need to step in. Companies like, for example, VeriSign, a billion-dollar communications corporation that, as of today, manages 2 of the 13 root name servers and has full authority over everyday staples like .net and .edu. But how would this all be facilitated? Strap in, again, because this is another thing entirely. We start at the top with ICANN. The corporation and its sub-organization IANA, or the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, has since 1998 been the sole group in charge of delegating and managing the myriad namespaces of the DNS. ICANN and IANA approve the creation of new TLDs, manage the regulations and standards surrounding the system as a whole, and partition out the ownership and management of domains to companies and organizations. The way they do this is by accrediting registries. A registry is any organization or company that, after a rigorous review process by ICANN, is granted authority and licensing permissions over 1 or more TLDs. In practice, this means that, well, they maintain the Bible of their TLD of choice. They own the TLD servers. Once a group is given the coveted registry status by IANA, they essentially become a domain dispenser. If you really want that .men domain, you're gonna have to take it up with the GRS Domains company. TLDs can and do get passed around a lot by these registries. When a company in possession of one goes under or gets acquired, ownership is going to get handed to somebody else. And when a new batch of TLDs first goes live, there's generally rounds of frantic public and private bidding to see who can get the rights to become its official registry. Exclusive ownership of a top-level domain can mean power, wealth, and influence, and there's a lot of people who'd really like to get their hands on one. The exception to this, of course, are CC TLDs, things like .uk, .de, and .ru. These are created for and managed by just entire countries, and they sort of exist in their own little domain. But excluding these, chances are any site you've visited in your lifetime had to first buy its domain from a company like VeriSign. I bring them up again because, alongside their being probably the heaviest hitter in the DNS field, owning a solid chunk of the original Big 8 TLDs and 2 of the world's root servers, they also in a sense represent the culmination of several brutal decades in the domain trade. See, in 1992, right before registry became a lucrative state of being, the National Science Foundation put out a contract for companies willing to construct and maintain infrastructure for the DNS of tomorrow. This being the antebellum pre-Eternal September period, the contract received only a small handful of bidders, the winner being a modest Virginia-based tech consulting company called Network Solutions. Now, being the winner, Network Solutions basically got the whole cake. They were granted registry status over .com, .net, .org, .mil under subcontract, full ownership of the original A-root server, even operation of the Whois lookup service. But when the NSF very controversially gave Network Solutions the ability to charge fees for registration in 1995, companies smelled blood in the water and immediately got to work divvying that cake up. The same year, a government tech contractor called Science Applications International Corporation bought out Network Solutions, and for the next 5 years saw it transform into a high-octane money machine. During this period of lucrative, explosive expansion, a number of other domain-adjacent companies would either manifest from thin air thanks to the sheer temptation of entering the domain's business, or shift gears from whatever else they were doing to focus on it, spurred on by encouragement from a collection of government agencies and committees to break the Network Solutions monopoly. At the height of the dot-com bubble in 2000, Network Solutions was acquired by one such company, VeriSign. The former cryptographic certification company held on to Network Solutions till 2003, when it was again sold to an equity group for many millions. This game of domain service hot potato continued throughout the primordial days of the early modern web, with Network Solutions buying things and being bought, transformed, divested, bought by web.com, merged, renamed, unrenamed, and so on ad infinitum. These days, power over the commercial face of DNS is consolidated largely in a handful of large companies, including, of course, Network Solutions and VeriSign, but also featuring more multifaceted groups like Google and Cloudflare and Cogent. Nobody only deals in DNS anymore, and you can bet good money that any given tech or telecom company has at least one of its hands in the business. Oh, and remember, we're not actually all the way down the pyramid yet. All these guys, as mentioned way back, are the registries. They keep the big books that contain every domain name in the known universe, and thanks to the 1995 decision, they have the authority to make money off every domain they register. But they aren't always the ones selling them. On the next tier, we have the registrars. This role, the name of which, according to legend, was added by Jake Feinler as a replacement for czar in the original RFC, represents the long arm of the system through which domains are actually sold. While Identity Digital may own the .coupon registry and server, they need an ICANN certified registrar that can talk to a company, sell them a .coupon name, and pay Identity Digital the fee to register it. You can think of registrars as the salesmen of the domain name world. And as you might expect, there's just as much cash, if not more, in the act of registraring as there is in registrying. In fact, while a number of companies perform registrar services as their primary function, like Namecheap, most of the major groups like GoDaddy are both registries and registrars, having their cake and selling it too. Furthermore, even in these cases, they aren't limited to just selling domains that they own. Any registrar can sell domains with TLDs belonging to any registry, as long as they have an agreement. Imagine a Ford dealership that has a Ford factory attached to it, but can also sell Toyotas and Audis as long as they pay them a seller's fee. The fact is, everybody has their hands in everything, and that doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon. Down another step in the pyramid, we have domain resellers, who are essentially registrars but without any of the certifications. And at the very bottom, of course, is you, the domain name buyer. You're now the proud owner of a new domain name, and your request only had to go through multiple levels of established corporate and organizational hierarchy to be confirmed. The big takeaway here is that there's, in a sense, two domain name systems in action today. The first and most basal is the technical DNS. Many long years of technological advancement and standard making distilled into hundreds of miles of fiberglass boards and great hunks of silicon memory. You, the client, make a simple request, and the many moving parts of the DNS fetch exactly what you seek from a boundless digital library before you even know that it started. But the second is the formal and commercial DNS. Decades, not of scientific study, but of bureaucratic organization, corporate intrigue, and fierce competition that's coalesced into a well-oiled international business machine. For better or for worse, these two sides of the coin have for many years coexisted, and with time have cemented themselves as one of the most foundational pillars of the modern web and the internet as a whole. So, naturally, people are gonna try to fuck with it. DNS attacks, as they're so appropriately called, have existed for almost as long as the system itself, and they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. As can be expected, the overwhelming majority trend towards the more petty end of the spectrum. Attacks like spoofing, where the attacking agent essentially poisons the cache of a resolver by sending false DNS responses with a man-in-the-middle approach, eventually directing traffic to a mock-up of the desired site designed to grab data, or a different site entirely. Attackers have also been known to hijack authoritative name servers, to bypass firewalls by sending packets disguised as DNS queries, and much, much more. A 2022 report by the International Data Group found that organizations with an emphasis on network services and remote work experience, on average, around 7 attacks yearly. And this is really nothing new. But every so often, someone gets the bright idea to attempt an attack on that most fortified keep of the domain name system, the root servers. And once in a blue moon, they actually manage to do it. Now, actually causing trouble for root is famously difficult, due in part to the system's extensive use of IP anycast, a load reduction technique through which a root server's single IP is broadcast to exist at multiple locations, each housing one or more identical instances of the given server. To take down droot, you don't just have to DOS a single server, you have to DOS 87 of them. To date, throughout the entire history of the system, only 3 attacks have ever managed to successfully deal damage to root. Once in 2002, again in 2007, and most recently in 2015. And we're going to do them in reverse order for reasons that may or may not become apparent soon. In the early morning hours of November 30th, 2015, all DNS root server addresses, with the notable exception of D, L, and M root, suddenly and unexpectedly became targets in a raging flood of DNS queries for the domain www.336901.com. The flood increased in volume until it reached its peak, a record frequency of just over 5 million requests per second to some root addresses. The 2 VeriSign-owned roots, A and J, reported close to 1 billion individual IPv4 addresses involved in the attack, suggesting both a botnet and IP spoofing to boot. At the height of the 160-minute attack, involved servers were being pounded with over 100 times the average daily peak traffic, before the requests eventually died down. A repeat of the attack, this time shorter in length, occurred at around 5 o'clock UTC the next day. During the attack, a small number of root sites were in fact taken down, but the built-in caching and redundancy of the system ensured that no significant loss of service was recorded. The entire event was over in under 24 hours, and were it not for the reports published later by root owners, the vast majority of users would have been none the wiser. Now, part of the reason this attack was able to be absorbed so effectively was thanks to lessons learned in previous attacks, the most recent of which being at exactly 12 o'clock UTC on February 6th of 2007, the root servers came under attack from what was eventually hypothesized to be a botnet based somewhere out of the South Pacific. While the volume of the attack was significantly lower than that which the system would be subjected to 8 years later, only peaking at around 1 gigabit per second as opposed to the 2015 peak of 35, the hardware and software that comprised root wasn't nearly as robust as it would later become. Most notably, it had 2 critical weak points, groot and lroot, run by the Department of Defense and ICANN respectively, as they were the only sites involved in the attack yet to incorporate anycast. The deluge lasted around 2.5 hours. Most root sites were able to weather it, but G and L, along with F and M to a lesser extent, were almost entirely crippled, only barely remaining operational. And in all likelihood, the damage would have been far greater were it not for the adoption of anycast following the most catastrophic root attack in the entire 3-decade history of the system, just 5 years earlier. The date is October 21st, 2002. The last major change to root took place just 5 years ago with the establishment of mroot in Japan in early 1997, and the system has only just solidified into its most modern incarnation. And at around 5 p.m. UTC, the root servers were suddenly rocked by an attack that paralyzed them in a way never seen before and not seen again since. The methodology this time was considerably different. The 2002 attack, rather than slamming the server inboxes with millions of requests, made a weapon of ICMP, The Internet Control Message Protocol operates on the same layer as protocols like IP, and is conventionally used for simple checks on the status and connectivity of two or more devices in a network. It's most known for being the protocol used by the ping tool, and most ICMP requests are the equivalent of a simple hi in expectance of an equally simple response. Now imagine several thousand highs every second. This is what each and every root server was suddenly and unceremoniously subjected to that October night. The targets of what's known as a ping flood attack, in which hundreds, thousands, or even millions of ICMP pings are sent in rapid succession with the goal of jamming a server's ability to respond. The strike began abruptly and continued for around an hour. Reportedly, the highest recorded traffic volume was measured at FRoot, managed by the Internet Systems Consortium, clocking in at around 80 megabits per second. This was, of course, less than a 1/12 of the peak that would be recorded 5 years later, but it was significantly more damaging, as only one of the 13 servers had even begun to implement Anycast protocols. Throughout the course of the attack, 9 of the 13 root sites were not just slowed, but actually downed for a brief, chaotic moment. While the exact details are hazy, this 2002 metric of round-trip times from the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis would seem to suggest that only L, I, E, and C were able to remain fully active throughout the attack's duration. Of course, even if all 13 were brought down, it wouldn't exactly immobilize the internet, at least not completely. Caching saves lives, and in all honesty, a number of internet users may not have even noticed. But that doesn't make it any less astounding that for a little under an hour on October 22nd of 2002, seemingly never to be repeated, the domain name system almost ground to a complete halt. Its millions of moving parts, hundreds of servers, scores of behemoth corporate investors, and millions of reliant users for an almost imperceptible moment were very nearly stopped for the first and only time. And that, if you'll excuse me, seems like a perfectly reasonable place to end off for the evening. The domain name system, like so much of the modern internet, is not perfect. It never really has been, to be entirely honest. But again, like so much of the internet, it's just so damn fascinating. It's a system operating on a scale that was virtually unthinkable just a generation or two ago. And the fact that it's able to function on this level, basically unseen and unknown to the vast majority of its own users, makes it all the more surreal. Or who knows? Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the only person here who actually thinks any of this stuff is even remotely interesting. But be that the case, I appreciate it regardless if you've stuck around this long and listened to me ramble. And with that, I'll take my leave. Personally, I don't have anywhere to be right now, but I'm thinking that you might. And even if you don't, I trust you to find something. Have a good night, everybody, and thank you, as always, for watching.